forces of evolution have been shaping plants for thousands or millions of years before agriculture. These evolutionary forces acted to maximize individual plant fitness. That is, the individual plant's ability to grow, survive, and reproduce itself. However, farmers are not concerned about individual plant reproductive success. They care about the reproductive success of the whole plant community. When farmers grow a crop, unless it's something like an intercrop, these crops are generally of the same species and the same variety, but evolutionarily, they have been designed to be competitors. We want them to be friends, to collaborate and maximize yields together, but there are strong evolutionary forces that mitigate this cooperation. Evolution has shaped plant behavior in really, really good ways. Don't get me wrong. Things like C4 photosynthesis, for example, right? Evolution has done things that we could never do as humans in terms of improving plant productivity or crop productivity. So many crop management decisions are made to essentially improve plant cooperation, thereby improve crop performance, that is plant community performance, at the expense of individual plant performance. Crop height is a great example about how evolution occurring in natural ecosystems can run counter to what we want to see happening in our managed temperate cropping systems. So in nature, taller plants are more successful because they shade their neighbors, they make their neighbors less competitive, and they capture more light. And so in a natural ecosystem, the optimal plant height is to be a little bit taller than your neighbor. And so, for example, in many of small grain cereals, things like oats, wheats, barley, their pre-crop ancestors, the more successful of them would be taller. But in managed systems, agricultural systems, remember, we don't care about individual plant performance. We care about the community performance. And so a plant that grows very, very tall might shade its neighbor, but we care about that neighbor too, and we don't want it to be overly shaded by a tall neighbor. So on average, taller crops do not capture more light. Remember, going back to that yield equation, they're more susceptible to lodging. We talked about that in the first lecture. And they allocate more carbon to the stem than to the grain. Remember that law of conservation of matter. If carbon is fixed via photosynthesis and it goes to the stem, well, it can't go to the grain where it contributes to yield. And so taller plants are good in natural ecosystems, but we don't really want very tall plants in our managed systems. We want to maximize community performance. So there's a number of different ways farmers can manage the height of their crop canopy. Number one would be variety selection. So choosing if they want a dwarf or semi-dwarf variety of wheat or oats. This would be different if they're growing something like oats for the straw, then they'd want a taller variety. But for grain, they would want a shorter variety. Farmers can also use what's called plant growth regulators. And these are chemicals which are antagonists to plant hormones that are responsible for stem elongation. So, for example, the gibberellic acid is a type of hormone that produces lengthens the internodes in like wheat or oats. And certain plant growth regulators will stop gibberellic acid from doing that. So these plant growth regulators essentially shorten the internodes on a cereal stem, thereby reducing plant height. There's some interesting management implications for trying to make a crop more cooperative rather than competitive. And I'll talk a bit about a research project that highlights this. So in an earlier lecture, you'll remember I talked about the Green Revolution and how there was a G by M interaction. We had wheat that had dwarfing genes that were much shorter than older wheat varieties, and that allowed farmers to push higher nitrogen rates onto wheat without causing lodging. That phenomenon has been much less successful in oats. So modern oat varieties are much taller than modern wheat varieties, and oats, at high nitrogen rates, oats still tend to lodge. And so the recommended nitrogen rate on oats in the province is 40, 45, maybe 50 pounds of nitrogen an acre. and that's roughly half of what would be put onto modern winter wheat. And so while there has been breeding progress on increasing lodging resistance in oats, it's not quite there at the level that would be ideal. There's still quite a bit of lodging that can happen from year to year. So there's a question of if a farmer, if they want to increase their nitrogen rates, if they want to push nitrogen and therefore try to get higher yields, can they apply a plant growth regulator and that allows them to do that? In other words, is there this synergy between higher nitrogen rates and a plant growth regulator? So the hypothesis, scientifically speaking, was that yes, there is this synergy between PGRs and higher nitrogen rates in terms of profitability. And so as a scientist, you want to set up an experiment that will falsify your hypothesis. And so that's what we did. This experiment was done last year in 2 locations. It'll be repeated again next year. It was a split plot experimental design. So the main plot factor was a PGR, right? With or without PGR. The split plot factor was one of 5 nitrogen rates. And so going from basically 0 control to a typical rate, which was, say between 40 and 80 kilos, all the way to 160, which is very, very high. And basically you're getting that crop to lodge. Then the split plot factor was 2 different varieties that differed in their lodging susceptibility. The whole trial got a fungicide at flag leaf. That's important to note because especially with small grain cereals, lodging risk increases almost exponentially once you get fungal infection. So fungicides they're kind of like plant growth regulators in that they can reduce lodging just by virtue of reducing disease severity. Okay, so using these 5 nitrogen rates, I could calculate at every location and in both the varieties and then with and without plant growth regulator the economically optimum nitrogen rate. And I won't get into the details about how I did that, but basically what I'm calculating is what was the most profitable nitrogen rate for a farmer to apply, given a variety with or without plant growth regulators. And the idea was that in the treatments with that PGR applied, that economically optimum N rate would be higher, right? Indicating that a farmer would be able to increase their nitrogen rates profitably with that PGR above what they would without a PGR. So a couple of points here on timing of plant growth regulator application. It'll depend on the product. It'll depend if we're talking about winter or spring cereals, but generally you're applying this just around the start of stem elongation. Okay, that's between GS30 to GS32. And those 2 are on the Zadok scale, referring to the first and second internode respectively. So to actually stage, say, an oat crop for GS, growth stage 31, 32, you actually have to go either open up the stem and look for the nodes or feel the stem for the internodes. There's a good video on how to do this on YouTube, and it's right at the bottom of this slide. The thing to keep in mind is that this window between GS30 and 32 for effective PGR application in Ontario, it can be quite short in spring cereals, 3 or 4 days, depending on the year or the location. And the reason for this is, of course, temperature, heat. Heat drives development. In Ontario, temperatures around GS30, 32 for spring cereals are quite high, or they can be quite high, compared to, say, the UK or New Zealand, where PGRs are much more commonly used. And so this window of application, GS30, 32, can be very short. So here are results for the 2020 growing season for the nice variety. So this is the oat variety in the trial that was considered lodging susceptible. And so you can see both locations, with and without PGR, what the economically optimal N rate was. At Winchester and at New Liskeard, using PGRs effectively increased the economically optimum N rate. You can see at the bottom of the slides the assumptions for the cost of nitrogen, revenue for oats, and the cost of PGRs. And I just got this from either publicly available data or just asking a couple of growers for kind of what they thought were appropriate costs. Anyway, looking at the EONR, the N rate, yes, using a PGR on variety nice at both locations allowed a farmer to increase their N rate. They could push N rates more successfully. And so what ended up happening is if a farmer applied that higher N rate with a PGR, they ended up with more yield and ended up with more revenue. And The profitability, so looking at returns to the nitrogen and PGR, so revenue minus the cost of nitrogen minus the cost of the PGR, you could see that at the Winchester location, yields were actually very low, right, below 3 tons per hectare. And revenue, there was a slight bump with that PGR from $304 to $325 per hectare, but that's like less than $10 an acre, right? So not a huge increase in returns, but it was there. But at New Liskard, where we had much higher yields on this lodging susceptible variety, there was quite a high return to using that PGR. That's an equivalent to almost $40 a acre. So that's a pretty high return. So in any case, using Variety Nice in this year, you would come out ahead using this plant growth regulator and bumping up your nitrogen rates. If we look now to the lodging resistant variety, Nicholas, it's a completely different story. I won't run through all the data, but essentially just looking at that last column, returns to nitrogen and PGR use, it did not pay to use that plant growth regulator on this lodging resistant variety. A farmer would have lost money. That said, they could increase their nitrogen rate. They could bump up their nitrogen rate. And so there actually was less lodging with the PGR. And so if that's something a farmer's concerned about, standability, then a PGR is a good tool to use. However, it was not necessarily profitable on this variety. And it seems like this is just the reality with plant growth regulators in Ontario, right? Because I've been involved in helping look at data from a number of on-farm trials in the province that OMAFRA is doing on PGR effectiveness, and it just depends. There's a lot of G by E by M interactions going on, and as someone like a scientist or an agronomist, you need to think through and try to unravel these to understand what's going on. So aside from crop height, we can also think about leaf area. So in natural ecosystems, the leafier the plant is, the better it can shade neighbors. Again, it can minimize competition with its neighbors by shading them. It can hedge against insect and herbivore defoliation. So, you'll produce more leaves than you might need because, well, you don't know if there's going to be an elephant that roams by or whatever, an insect that munches on one of them. So you have kind of extra leaves. There's a benefit to having a couple extra leaves. If you're a grass, you're going to have lots of tillers because that's, in natural ecosystems, a good hedge for survival. You'll take advantage of very good years by having lots of tillers. But in managed systems, leafier plants aren't necessarily beneficial, right? If you have plants that have lots of leaves, well, they might not intercept more radiation. Remember that alpha from the yield equation. If you have lots and lots of leaves, you're just going to end up shading other leaves. And so you're not actually increasing the interception of PAR. You're just shading leaves that would have otherwise intercepted that PAR. And so you're wasting carbohydrates and nutrients that could otherwise go to the grain or to the roots or to have some other productive function. They're being overinvested in leaves. So like the harvest index that we discussed in a previous video, leaf area index is really a fundamental measurement to assess temperate cropping systems. So again, this is an agronomic measurement because we're looking at something on a per land area basis. And what leaf area does is it says, okay, we as farmers do not care so much about individual plant leaf area, how big the leaves are on an individual plant. We care about total leaf area at a crop level. So leaf area index is when you take a random sample of a square meter in a field, and then you take all the leaves from all the plants in that square meter and you measure that leaf area. And the leaf area index is, again, a ratio of the total area of the leaves per area of ground. So from a crop management perspective, what's important to note is that canopy interception, again, part of that yield equation we talked about earlier, the proportion of PAR intercepted by the canopy achieves a near maximum at a particular LAI. So in the case of soybeans, this is data from soybeans, radiation interception is almost maximized, 95% at an LAI of 3. And so to achieve 100% radiation interception, you would need to almost double leaf area from 3 to 6. And generally, from a cost-benefit analysis, that investment is not worth it, right? It's better for that crop to not invest in leaf area going from 3 to 6, but to take those carbohydrates and nutrients and invest that in the grain. So from a crop management perspective, there is a near optimal LAI, an LAI where that farmer is achieving almost 100% solar radiation interception, and they're not overinvesting, that crop is not overinvesting in leaves at the expense of grain. So just to note here that in soybean, a leaf area index of 3 is sufficient to maximize solar radiation interception, achieve near 100%. And if you remember from that earlier presentation about yield improvement in Ontario soybean varieties, newer higher yielding varieties of soybean had lower leaf area index, and that was almost a paradox, but it's not a paradox when you understand what's going on here, right? We were over-investing, earlier varieties were over-investing in LAI. They weren't getting a good benefit in terms of increasing radiation interception, and by reducing LAI, reducing crop investment in leaf area, they could still maintain very high radiation interception percentage and use those carbohydrates more effectively somewhere else in the crop. Two of the main ways farmers manipulate leaf area index in their crop production systems is by adjusting row spacings and seeding rates. So management factors like row spacing or seeding rate are being manipulated for various ends, right? A grower or a farmer is trying to get very high radiation interception, but they're also trying to balance, for example, seed costs, equipment availability, and the risk of white mold, which is influenced by canopy wind speed or intra-canopy wind speed, and that is in turn affected by things like row spacing or seeding rate, plant density. For example, in Mississippi, optimal row spacing for soybean production is around 30 inches, and optimal final plant stands around 90,000 plants per acre. In Ontario, your optimal row spacing is going to be around 15 inches, so much narrower, and also, optimal plant stand at the low end will be 125,000 plants per acre. Okay, so in Ontario, we need narrower rows and more plants per acre. And again, that's because of the shorter growing season. That crop needs to achieve quicker canopy closure to maximize radiation interception because there's just not enough radiation over the growing season to get high yields. And so we need to take advantage of the radiation we do get in Ontario by getting more rapid canopy closure. The last management practice that I'll talk about that relates to increasing cooperation among crop plants is this idea of even emergence and management practices that increase the evenness of emergence. And by that I mean that all these seeds are germinating and emerging out of the ground at the same time, within 24 hours of each other. And so many agronomists, high yield contest winners, etc., harp on the importance of even emergence. And maybe you don't realize why is that important for temperate crop production. So let's think this through in terms of improving crop cooperation. The mechanism at work here is quite simple. If we have uneven emergence, we do not have plant stand uniformity. Plants that emerge first get a head start on their slower emerging neighbors. They grow quicker than their neighbors. They manage to shade their neighbors and outcompete them for resources like nutrients and water and light. This creates what crop physiologists call a hierarchy, a dominance hierarchy in that crop stand where we have dominant plants that are early emerging and then dominated plants that are slower emerging, and they're dominated by their neighbors. Okay, they're dominated plants. And so the less even emergence is, right? If plants are emerging, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 days different, then the intensity of this dominance hierarchy is going to increase. And if we have a completely even emergence, say every single plant emerges at the same day, then we do not have a dominance hierarchy, or a very, very small one. As you would expect, dominant plants, the early emergers that are surrounded by slower emerging neighbors, those dominant plants have much higher yields than their dominated neighbors. And here's a photo that I took again at Winchester this fall. You could see a difference between one plant emerged, say, the first day its neighbor emerged day 6. Look at the difference in that apical ear. Okay. This difference in yield between dominated and dominant plants does not necessarily create a yield reduction on a per area basis. A yield reduction will only occur if the yield increase in the dominant plants is lower than the yield decrease in the dominated plants. Okay, so let me just here's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say with even emergence, per plant yield is 300 grams per plant in that crop. With uneven emergence, the dominant plant is going to have slightly higher yields because it's bigger, it's taking up more nutrients, more resources, so it'll say have a 50 gram per plant yield increase. But its neighbors, the dominated plants, have a yield reduction of 100 grams per plant. And so the yield increase from the dominant plant is just not enough to compensate for the lower per plant yields in those dominated plants. And so then we have an overall yield decrease per area. This is not always the case. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this varies across crops. So the yield penalty associated with uneven emergence is going to depend on the phenotypic plasticity of yield components of that variety or of that crop. So certainly across varieties, there will be differences in the yield penalty of uneven emergence. But I want to focus right now on crop-specific yield penalties. So looking at, for example, corn and soybeans, it's been demonstrated a bunch of times that the yield penalty of uneven emergence is much higher in corn than in soybean. And that makes sense just thinking about phenotypic plasticity, right? An individual corn plant typically produces one productive ear. And so it's constrained by, it's really only able to adjust kernel number per ear because it's just producing one ear if it's dominated or dominant. Soybean is different, right? A dominant soybean plant that emerges early, it can grow much larger. It can have a larger number of nodes, a larger number of pods per plant. And that can that plasticity of yield components allows a dominant soybean plant to yield much, much more than a dominated soybean. And so there's a compensation going on at the field scale. Looking at wheat, what the yield penalty of uneven emergence in wheat is, my guess is that it falls somewhere between the yield penalty of uneven emergence of corn and soybeans. It's somewhere in the middle. There's not a whole lot of good data on the yield penalty of emergence evenness and wheat. Wheat can tiller. And that means that a dominant wheat plant can adjust its yield, increase its yield by tillering more than the dominated wheat plant, its neighbor that might not tiller at all. And so I think there's more plasticity in terms of yield components with wheat. So the yield penalty of uneven emergence will not be as great as in corn. That said, more research is needed, and it's actually very labor intensive to measure corn emergence or whatever. It's actually quite labor intensive to do these types of studies. I'm doing one right now, and what we do is essentially put a flag. It's called a flag test, where you're going out into a field every day and putting flags. Did this emerge today? I'm putting one color flag. You return the next day, you put a different color flag. And so you can come back at the end of the season and say, okay, this plant emerged day 1, this plant emerged day 6. In corn, this is again data from Ontario. The yield reduction can be quite dramatic of uneven emergence. So this is data from a study where I'm looking at corn emergence across different tillage systems and cover crop treatments. So it's a tillage by cover crop experiment. This video is long enough. I don't want to go into the details for your sake. But you can see this is like 429 plants that we measured what day it emerged, what was its per plant yield. And the data suggests that you got around 2 days for that crop to emerge without getting a dominance hierarchy, right? If it's emerging on day 1 or day 2, per plant yield is quite high. There's not a huge dominance hierarchy. Once you get into a 3-day delay in corn emergence or more, then we start getting a more dramatic yield reduction. And the largest comparison here, emerging day 1 versus day 6, it's a 50% yield reduction per plant. And this ends up reducing or increasing the variability of per area yield. So the more emergence variability you'll have, the yield will be much more variable across a field.